Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is Amazing Fantasy 15, cover dated August of 1962. This issue marks the first appearance of Spider-Man, as well as several of his supporting characters, including Uncle Ben, Aunt May, and Flash Thompson. The issue was written by Stan Lee and drawn by Steve Ditko. Our story begins with a rather sullen splash page, showing teenager Peter Parker as he's awkwardly standing apart from a nearby group of his classmates. They are the popular kids of his school and are looking for another student to come to the dance with them. Noticing that Peter's nearby, one speaks up and asks if he'd make a good addition. But the group's ringleader Flash Thompson quickly rejects the idea and claims that Peter is nothing but a clumsy geek. While he finds no comfort in his classmates, Peter can always look forward to returning home to his two elderly guardians, Aunt May and Uncle Ben. Ever since they became his caretakers, they've lovingly supported and doted over their nephew, who's given them much to be proud of, as he's among the highest achieving students at his school. He's especially adept at science, as its strict laws and predictable nature come naturally to him. Thus it's no surprise that the only subject he struggles with is love, the most unpredictable of all. We see as much as Peter is uncomfortably approaching one of his classmates. He awkwardly asks her out, but she doesn't entertain the thought and instead callously rejects him for the cruel but popular Flash Thompson. Yet Peter can't seem to take a hint as he next approaches a group of classmates and asks if any of them want to accompany him to a nearby science exhibit. They of course coldly reject him, leaving the despondent teenager to travel to it alone. But at least it's there that he finds reprieve through his passion for science. Of particular interest is an incredible atomic instrument, one that's demonstrating humanity's newfound mastery over the atom. But that mastery may be overstated, as no one notices the sudden arrival of a tiny spider descending from the ceiling above. The otherwise insignificant arachnid accidentally finds itself in between two radioactive nodules. Thus it absorbs a great deal of radiation and tiredly tumbles off of its string and onto Peter's hand. In a state of shock, the dying arachnid then frantically bites him and perishes only moments later. Peter's shocked to see that its corpse is burning red, an odd sensation that then travels to his own forehead. Thinking that he needs some air, Peter stumbles outside and onto the street. It's there that he notices a change in his body, as if it's been supercharged by a mysterious energy. But he's so caught up in this strange feeling that he fails to notice a car barreling in from behind. Yet he instinctively and mightily leaps out of the way. Somehow he'd sprung onto a nearby wall, one that he's now inexplicably clinging to like a spider. But it gets even better, as he next discovers that he can climb it too. Thus in just a few seconds he's reached the top of the building and grabs a hold of a nearby pipe. But the pipe amazingly crinkles within his grasp, confirming in Peter's mind that he's been transformed by his spider bite. Confronted with these unbelievable abilities, Peter realizes that he can use them to strike rich. He notices a sign advertising a $100 reward to anyone who can last 3 minutes with the wrestler Crusher Hogan. He decides to take up the offer, but is unsure of his newfound power, and thus races home to craft an identity-concealing costume that'll protect his already poor reputation if he loses. Once it's finished, he rushes back to the wrestling ring and takes up Crusher Hogan's challenge. The champion wrestler thinks nothing of a seeming weakling like Peter, and thus happily accepts what he thinks will be a short match. It turns out that he's right, but not for the reason he thinks. Instead it's actually Crusher who's embarrassed in the ring, as Peter uses his new abilities to toss him around like a ragdoll. The crowd is expectedly amazed, but particularly intrigued is a cigar-smoking promoter. He approaches Peter after the fight and offers him a chance to appear on a popular variety show, while still maintaining his anonymity. Peter jumps on the opportunity, and thus the issue shifts forward sometime later as he's in his room crafting a more flashy spider-themed costume. But he's then interrupted by the sudden arrival of his aunt and uncle. Yet they're only there to lovingly drop off a plate of milk and cookies, and thus quickly leave without noticing Peter's new costume. While he's grateful for the gesture, he's too focused on his work to even touch them, as beyond just tight-fitting fabric, he's also crafted a pair of wrist-mounted synthetic web shooters. The strength of his webs is close to that of an actual spider, as a fully costumed Peter is easily able to dangle from a strand stuck to his ceiling. With these web shooters done, Peter's ready to head off for his booked appearance on the variety show. But before he does, he adds one finishing touch, a name, that being Spider-Man. The issue then shifts forward as he's arrived on set and is dazzling audiences around the nation with his incredible abilities. When it's over, he's immediately hounded by numerous publishers, producers and journalists, all eager to capitalize on the national sensation that Spider-Man's sure to be. But Peter turns them all down and exits through a nearby hallway. It's there that he encounters a criminal fleeing from a pursuing policeman. The crook runs right past him and escapes into an elevator, but Peter does nothing about it. When the policeman asks why he didn't bother helping, Peter callously declares that he's done being pushed around and is now just looking out for himself. So he leaves, and we next see him back home, where his aunt and uncle are presenting him with a microscope that he'd been wanting. Peter graciously accepts the gift and silently remarks that with his newfound fame, he'll make sure his aunt and uncle are always happy, while everyone else can suffer for all that he cares. But the issue then shifts forward several days later, as we learn that Spider-Man's become a national sensation as expected. His success on the variety show has been replicated on several others, and it's from one of these appearances that we see Peter returning home one evening. His otherwise pleasant arrival is quickly soured by the presence of several policemen. Tragically, they inform him that his Uncle Ben had been killed in a robbery gone wrong. If only to ease his ensuing fury, the policeman tells Peter that they've cornered the killer to an old warehouse on the city's waterfront. But that's all the enraged teenager needs to hear, as he rushes into his house and quickly changes back into his Spider-Man costume. He doesn't bother with secrecy, as Aunt May is at their neighbor's grieving. Thus in mere moments Peter's back in costume and sneaking out to confront his uncle's killer. Using his webs to swing across buildings, he's able to quickly reach the warehouse. There are already several policemen surrounding the building, but they don't notice as he sneaks in. Inside he doesn't waste any time confronting his uncle's killer, who's frightened by the shadowy figure crawling towards him. The crook tries to run away, but there's nowhere to flee within the warehouse. So he finds himself cornered and desperately tries to pull out his handgun. But it's no use, as Peter shoots a web to clog the weapon and then lands a single punch that knocks the killer out. Peter then rushes over to see the man who had slain his uncle, but is horrified when he realizes that it's the same criminal he'd ignored days prior. But he doesn't have much time to wrestle with this revelation, as it's then that the police captain orders his men to charge the warehouse. Before they even have the chance though, they notice that strung up from underneath the building is the killer, tangled up in a mess of webs. Of course it was Peter's doing, who's since fled to a far-off alley, away from prying eyes. It's there that he's forced to reckon with the realization that if he had not selfishly chosen to ignore the fleeing criminal, he very well may have prevented his uncle's death. With that, the issue subsequently ends as we see Peter walking down a dark and lonely street, learning his most important lesson in the hardest way. With great power comes great responsibility. That concludes Spider-Man's first appearance in Amazing Fantasy 15 and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was an exceptional story which featured the best origin that I've looked at thus far. This issue really illustrates just how comparatively bland other heroes' origins are. In the sense that a lot of them focus strictly on how they got their powers, but hardly give any time to explore their motivations for becoming a hero. This issue did the exact opposite, as the accident that gave Spider-Man his powers was given all of a few panels. The rest focused on his use of those powers, and especially the mistakes that he made with them. This is perhaps the most striking aspect of this issue, as armed with plenty of hindsight, we know that the death of Uncle Ben is permanent and something that Peter will wrestle with for the rest of his life. Compare that to some of these other heroes, who basically just get their powers, defeat the villain, and move on with no lasting impact on their psyche. It's not as profound or interesting, and I'm thus not surprised that Spider-Man has since become one of the most beloved superheroes of all time. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.